We have another webinar Wednesday. We're here with Johnny Sanders from Soma Cyber. Soma Cyber is a partner with DOF that works in policy development, security testing, and helping us to help our customers build, as we're talking about today, both your first and last line of defense. The purpose of today's conversation is to discuss the ways that policy can help you to avoid or prevent serious security events, as well as giving you the plan, the strategy, and also helping to build a culture that allows you to respond quickly if something does occur. We're always trying to make sure that we prevent attacks, but there's only so much you can do to prevent what seems like the inevitable. So we have to make sure that we're prepared for that if it does occur. So again, I'm Saeed Gordon with DOF Creations, passing it back to Johnny Sanders. Johnny, please feel free to introduce yourself.
Um, Good morning or good day, everyone. I am Johnny Sanders from Soma Cyber. I'm one of the founding partners here. Have a long history in IT management, security officer, and as well as IT auditing, consulting, and those kind of things. So our firm kind of is around the IT control testing, cybersecurity consulting, penetration testing, all of those things that you kind of need as a partner. Some people call it an IT audit. We don't go all the way into an IT audit type environment generally, because we are here to kind of be a partner consultant to help you grow and strengthen your overall information security maturity is kind of the goal there. So we're going to dig into policies, but kind of the whole reason we have policies, we're going to dig a little bit into breach data first. Look at risk assessments. The impacts of cybersecurity insurance is going to be a big topic for all of us, regardless of what industry you're in on this call. A little bit of policy ownership, because there's a lot of confusion there based on a lot of the clients we work with. And then, how do we assess the strength of these policies? And of course, I think at the end, we should have some times for Q&A before we get into any closing conversations. But breach data, I think looking at breach data is so important. There's a number of good industry reports out there. Verizon Data Breach Report, the IBM X-Force Report, that's done with the Panama Institute, Sophos. There's several good reports out there that I think are very executive friendly. So if we have CIOs and CISOs on the phone who are struggling to get the message up to management and those senior executives for better sponsorship of your programs, these are great reports that are very executive friendly. So we're going to leverage some of those in our conversations today. But one of the big topics of conversation this past year was ransomware. It is growing like mad. Per some of the industry's reports, this one from CyberInt on Q3, we had a record number of successful reported attacks. I will say reported quite often because there's a number of breaches that do not get reported publicly and to these type of reporting organizations. Some of the clients I've worked with in the past, they have been breached and never reported. They handled it with their insurance company. They decided to cover the cost, whatever that looked like. So it doesn't always get reported, and I'm sure most of you know that here. But of the reported ones, we had a record number of ransomware attacks this year. We will see record dollars. And I say this year, we're looking at 23 numbers. But it's been very interesting to see the number of attacks and how it grew, because initially it looked like we were off to a slower year. But 1,471 successful attacks in one quarter. There's a lot of money being spent when you look at the average cost of one of those breaches. If you look at what country's leading, the USA, that's 2,100 reported attacks in 2023. Based on all the breach data we hear, that kind of sounds like a low number. But if you look at that, that's 6 reported attacks per day. So if you're getting into the millions per attack, this is a very lucrative operation for attackers. And if you want to take a look at how we rank, the next closest country is 286 successful attacks. So it's very interesting to see how we rank against other countries when it comes to these cyber attacks. So, and I'm going to tell Saeed or anybody else on the call, if you have a question from our team here, please jump in and ask. That way we bring a little more data to you. But as we look at the cost of these attacks, the average cost per ransomware attack per the IBM report is 5.13 million. I'm going to tell you, if you look at the FBI report, you're going to see a significantly lower number. A lot of those reports from the government, on the government side of the fence, they're only looking at the cost of the ransom, not lost business, cost of recovery, forensics, all of these things that truly roll up into that cost of that breach. And that's what IBM looks at. It looks at all of those things. And I think that's very important because we all care about our bottom line and what we're having to spend to get our operations back up and running. So 5.13 million is a significant number. And that is a global number. US will tick a little bit higher than that. And that is up about 13% from 2022. I always bring up the topic of ransomware. If it were a country and we ranked it by GDP, it would be in the top 100 countries of the world. We're in the mid 20 billion mark just on cost of the ransoms. Cost of recovery runs that number up much, much higher. So it is a very successful method for attackers to take money from you, which is ultimately their goal most of the time. So the real impact here, and one of the things that we have a difficulty conveying to management sometimes, is the impact of it is the ability to operate. What happens to your organization once that ransom is engaged? You're looking at lost productivity, lost business, potentially lost customers. I know we have a lot of different industries that check in on these calls. Your government side of the fence, your city and state governments, a lot of times they're just bringing a lot of discomfort and inconvenience to the citizens. We've had a breach recently that I don't know that was publicized, but it was a county that was breached with a ransomware. They could not, none of their citizens could close on a home because they couldn't do title searches. So things were down that, while may have not had a financial impact to the city, it certainly impacted the citizens. So there's a lot of things that roll up into these that it's costing someone something. As we look at a little bit of recovery, one of the misconceptions that we hear a lot, we'll pay the ransom. Yes.
Sorry, I had myself on mute, so I was trying to ask you a question before you went on to your next slide.
Okay.
So I had a couple of questions, and following up on what you said about the title search thing, while that may not have a direct economic impact on, the city or the county, for that city or county economy and those businesses in the area, that does have an impact. Because if you're a realtor or something like that, you don't get paid until everything closes. You don't get paid until, the final, dot is dotted on that document. So, I mean, that's kind of where we look at I guess when you're talking about the 5.13 million, there's a lot of things that go into that. One question I had was, are they showing, or is IBM saying this money is coming out of pocket of the customer, or does this include insurance costs? Does this take into account for a public entity that they may be getting assistance from the county or from the state to help to offset costs? Does that take into account all of that?
It usually takes in all of the above, and that report has a really good breakdown of how the costs are broken down: recovery, response, and notification. If you have 100,000 people in your system that have just been affected by a breach, now you're paying some type of security monitoring services or credit monitoring services. That's a large chunk of recovery costs too that doesn't get factored in. And the painful part, based on your question, some of these fringe costs are not being covered by your insurance. So the insurance may come in and pay the ransom, but depending on how your policy is written, they may not be helping you with the credit monitoring services or the forensics cost and these things. So it is a little bit of everything that rolls into that cost, and they do try to factor in lost business. So if you're the Target breach from back in 2014, I mean, they lost hundreds of millions because that happened during the holiday gift buying season, and customers stayed away. So there was those impacts all roll up into this 5.13 million.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Another question I had was, um, obviously ransomware is continuing to grow and the cost continues to grow. Is there any indicator that there is a, not necessarily a stopping point, but that there will ever be a plateau? Is there anything we're seeing in regard to, um, you know, maybe FBI data showing the ability to track, catch, and potentially prosecute individuals who, are the bad actors? Um, is there anything indicating that we're ever going to see a plateau? Not necessarily just stopping, but at the very least, it's not going to keep growing exponentially.
yeah, unfortunately, when 2023 kicked off, there were reports almost bragging that, hey, ransom is dropping, or ransomware
Mhm.
attacks are dropping this year. So we started out a little slow, and then we ended up breaking a record. But based on what we're seeing and everything we're seeing from clients, working with our clients, as well as all of the industry reports that we try to gather and read, um, I I don't see this slowing down. It's one of the easiest methods for an attacker to get paid.
Mhm.
I can steal your data and try to sell it on the dark web, but I have to find a buyer who sees value in that data.
Mhm.
Nobody values their data more than the business owner or the stakeholder, right? We value our data way more than we value someone else's, so it's easier to sell it back to the owner of the data than it is to someone else. So when you look at those things, and now you even have, and we didn't even really get into in the slide deck here, is you have the encryptionless ransomware attacks that are going on. They're even easier because
Mhm.
they're coming in and stealing data and holding that data for ransom and say, pay the ransom or we're releasing it publicly. So not even on the dark web publicly. They're going to put it out on a public website that anybody can get to. So that is
Mhm.
working, and that's ticked up in 2023. So it's very interesting. And as of right now, I don't see any way to slow this down other than trying to find the best controls possible. And we'll talk a little bit later about data backups. I mean, the goal is to not pay the ransom. But long answer to your question, I do not see this slowing down. So,
Oh,
but
that feels great.
so on to kind of the misconception is, hey, insurance is going to pay the ransom, or we're going to pay the ransom, or we're going to get our data back. But when we look at reports from like Sophos, the state of ransomware, very good report again. They show you that the percentage of data restored after paying the ransom is only 61%. So that's imagine me walking into your organization and deleting 39% of your data and say, hey, okay, can you still function as an organization? Can you still sell your product or service your customer? And most likely there's going to be something vital in that 39% that's going to be damaging. And I know, again, we have a lot of different industries on this phone, but if you are considered a small business, this is huge to you because the stat hasn't changed much over the past 4 or 5 years. 65% of small businesses close within 6 months of a breach. Why? Because we can't function without our data, and we can't afford to recover it sometimes. So the follow up to that is the percentage of data, or the percentage of people that get everything back after they pay a ransom. It's only 4%. So it's very slim odds that you're going to get all of your functional data back where you can bring your organization back on track like they were pre-breach. So again, it's really important, and the Sophos report digs even deeper into how we're recovering. Some of it's being via the payment to the attacker to get it back, and then some of it is using your own data backups to try to build everything back up. But it is a difficult process, and the backups are going to be vital in this process.
Johnny, if you
Yes,
could go
sir.
back to that last slide, considering I mean, 61% is at the very least over 50%, but we look at 4% and being able to have 100% recovery. Um, as a partner who tries to build solutions for our customers, to me, that says that there are a lot of entities that maybe have incomplete plans or don't have plans in place for how they're going to back up their data, how they test their backups. Um, Understanding what it takes to get them to a place where they have reliable backups that they can use to bounce back. Is that what that says to you, or is that maybe an indication that the style of attack has continued to evolve and even reliable backups are getting corrupted, and maybe there's no way to ensure that you have a 100% reliable backup?
Well, the answer to the question as far as the plans is we look at incident response plans. And they're definitely weak, and
Mm,
the IBM report has some really good data on that topic as well. But from our working with our clients across pretty much all industries, I can tell you the incident response plan is probably, and disaster recovery plans are probably the two biggest ignored policies out there. So
mm,
when we are trying to assess our ability to recover and respond to an attack, um, you find the plans a little bit messy. And what we see is clients responding to an attack, are reacting to an attack instead of responding. We
mm.
want you to respond. We want you to have a practice playbook. And the interesting thing is that the IBM report shows that the organizations that have good, well thought out and practiced incident response plans and well established incident response teams save an average of $2 million over those who do not have good plans in place. So it kind of tells you right there that there's that plays into this ability to recover a little bit. But as it relates to the backups, we have to have immutable backups. We have to be backing up in multiple locations and doing some type of air gap backup. If we're not doing that, it's a very high likelihood that you are going to see your backups encrypted as well as your primary data. And kind of how we get this, we have to sell management on the risk here. They have to understand that, hey, we're not just asking for extra dollars to tie ourselves to some fancy new backup system. There's a real risk here, and we're trying to avoid risk with implementing the correct style of backups.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned selling management, on these things, and that's something, as we work with IT professionals and IT leaders, I think sometimes, obviously sales gets a bad rap because there are so many people who do it the wrong way. But I think a lot of times folks we work with in technology, they are, kind of science's version of an artist. They have their own unique way. They've come up with their own strategy for how to manage their network or to solve their organization's problems. And to tell someone that, you may need to sell somebody on your goal, on your idea, on your plan, on your vision, sometimes you see leaders react to that in a way that is, I guess they have a poor reaction to it.
Yeah.
And when you're saying, you have to sell management, that's something that we've been trying to stress as a team, as we talk to our customers or as we go to different speaking events. It's unfortunate it's another job that you have to do. It's another hat you're going to have to wear. But if the people that you work with in your organization do not believe why this is important, do not understand your vision, and are not in support of you taking the organization, the city, the county, the bank, whoever it might be, in this direction, then no one's going to be able to move forward. It's if you treat it like a sports team, a football team, you can have two great athletes on the team, but there's 50, 60, 70 people, depending on the level you're at, that are on board. And if they're not on board with you and not all going in pursuit of the same goal, then you're not going to be that successful. And I think that's one of the things, like, as soon as I hear you say selling management, it's unfortunate there are a lot of folks who see it as all of the negative things that come with sales rather than the positive that is getting people to understand why this thing that matters to you actually matters in real life. And
Well,
that's
and
that's something that we have to translate.
yeah.
We have to sell that.
And I think it's important also because when I say sell management, I'm
Mhm,
talking about the CIOs and the CISOs and the IT managers within the company or within that organization trying to sell their own management on an
mhm.
idea. That's what we see a lot. And unfortunately, our CEOs, our presidents, our board of trustees or board of directors, they all have very specific missions. They're seeing goals that we may not understand at our level.
Mhm.
So I think it's very important to make sure that these boards and your senior leaders, the C-suites, are getting some type of periodic information security training. Not to make them information security specialists, obviously, but so they understand the risk, and when these topics come up, they can respond accordingly. That's the selling we need to see, and that we see a problem with a big client base.
Yeah.
Healthcare and education, two of the biggest problems we see. You have the leaders focused on the mission, which is where we need them focused. But like to use your coaching analogy, or to use your sports team analogy, you can have two best players on the team, but if the coach doesn't understand the field or can't call the right play, these players are not going to be used,
Hmm.
to the best of their ability. But I think it's a very difficult conversation. I get asked the question pretty much every time I speak: how do we get management to pay attention? Sadly, get breached is probably the easiest way for them to pay attention. Um, but
Not the nicest way though.
yeah, not the nicest way, but probably the biggest leverage that's working is explaining to them that, hey, there's a chance your cybersecurity insurance is not going to pay because we don't have the controls in place that we're
Mhm.
expected to have in place. We have
Yeah.
to pay attention to these things if we truly want to be covered, and that's been helping.
Mhm.
That's at least perking up the ears and getting the conversation started. But I'll tell you, the organizations I work with that are in the best shape, the president, the CFOs, the senior leaders are in every meeting, and they require IT to be in every meeting. They want to hear the data, they need the data, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in the risk assessment piece. They have to understand the risk so they can make decisions based on that knowledge. But if they're sheltering or shielding or insulating themselves from this information, it's going to be very, very hard for your CIOs and CISOs to make positive ground in the world of security. It's a
Yeah.
tough topic. Whole nother presentation probably, but yeah, it's um,
Yeah. It's you're not lying. You're not lying. But
so.
continue, please.
All right. So we'll get a little bit more breach data, and then we're going to get more into the content of why we're here today. But as we look through the average cost of a breach, you're going to see a few things here. Healthcare, financial, there's a lot of organizations that fall under financial now. Education actually falls under, or higher ed falls under financial services. Car dealers, any type of lender, payday lenders, all of those fall under financial services, and very highly targeted industry. Education, public sector, I can tell you all of these numbers are a little bit skewed, because this is a global number. Um, 4.45 million is the average cost of a breach worldwide. In the USA, it's 9.48 million. So quite a bit more expensive in the USA to have a breach. So as you're looking at your particular industry on the screen, just understand that it's most likely going to tick a little bit higher than this. So take this data, make sure you're having the conversations with your cybersecurity insurance company, and that you are, if you're self-insured, that you have the right amount of money stashed away for the rainy day. So, but that's that. I kind of always run through breach data because it kind of will scare you into paying attention a little bit. Have a little bit more uh, awareness for why we're doing what we're doing. And again, I know all the different industries that are potentially on this call, you all have different compliance requirements from GOBA, NIST, HIPAA, whatever that may be. But at the end of the day, a lot of these frameworks that we're following are required to follow it, being NIST or CIS, et cetera. A lot of these controls are really easy to put in place, and some of them are free because you already own the systems to do it. So it's just going back to our topic of executive sponsorship, getting them involved with the conversation. But um, we're going to jump and kind of into the risk assessment process. And as we start digging into the policy process, as we say here, this is the foundation of your information security program. Um, Pretty much every framework you pick up is going to talk about your risk assessment and the importance of it. And we're no different. If you do not have a solid risk assessment updated, refreshed, it's kind of a living document, we can pretty much bet that there's some type of gap in your security environment, or in your security policies. But the whole point of a risk assessment in any form or fashion is just to protect value, the value of the business, the asset, whatever it is. And that's what we're kind of looking at here. And in the risk assessment process, doesn't matter who you're looking at, they pretty much have the same requirements. You're going to try to identify all of the internal and external threats to data. You're going to categorize those, you're going to score them, give them some type of inherent risk rating before any control is in place. Then you're going to identify the controls you actually have in place to address that risk. So a risk assessment can't be a wish list. It can't be what you want to have in place to reduce that risk. It has to be the actual control you're currently using. And then you score your residual risk, and that will help you determine whether your control is working the way you want it to. Then these identified controls, and we'll have a sheet on the screen in a minute that will kind of lay some of this out from a visual. But that control then becomes your written policy. Whatever you've determined that's going to save that device. Use your cell phone as an example. All of us have cell phones. All of us have a case on this cell phone. That case is there because we ran a risk assessment on our device. The risk of breaking it, we're going to reduce that risk with a case. So we're going to write that into policy. But at the end of the day, who does risk belong to? Who owns it? It's not IT. It's the stakeholders. It's management. It's your board. It's your senior executives. It's the owner of the company. They own the risk. It's very important that they understand that. I think your senior leaders in IT and management, they understand that, but it's not always understood when it comes to security. You have a million policies on a million different topics, but when you get to some type of security policy, oh, that's an IT function. Well, that's just not true, because they own the risk. They should be a part of the policy making process to reduce that risk. Per NIST 830, which is all about risk assessments, great document, free to download. Go grab it if you haven't gone through it. It makes understanding and kind of working through risk assessments more understandable. It's a long document, but there's some key sections in there that'll help you out. But they will tell you here that you must communicate the risk assessments to the stakeholders to ensure that the decision makers across the industry or across the organization can make appropriate control decisions. That's the ones who are responsible for making the control decisions. Well, I'm going to talk about that again in a minute, but the risk assessment itself, everybody has a different type of risk assessment. I know there's vendors that sell risk assessments. I've seen some I love. I've seen some I couldn't even get to the bottom line of the risk or the control because it was so muddy. Do not overcomplicate the process. As it's stated, you're going to identify your internal and external risk or threats to data or your systems. Have a little inherent score, as we kind of have on the left-hand side of the controls column here. Likelihood, impact, we should be measuring those things. Then the controls column will identify the control that we have in place to reduce that risk. And then on the right-hand side of the control column is where your residual ratings come in. Now on this one, this is actually a screenshot from a client that I worked with. No names on the screen or anything like that, but we had to highlight the control column in yellow because they didn't have proper controls around, doing background checks on their employees. And they were in an industry where you definitely should be doing background checks. But if you're going through NIST 800-171 compliance, it's a requirement that you have that in place. And this organization had to be 800-171 compliant. So they were missing that piece. But other things here, sensitive information not disposed of properly. What does your shredding look like? Are you locking your documents up at night? There's all kind of different things that's going to be captured in this risk assessment document. But ultimately, there's 2 points here. Do not overcomplicate it. And the most important point is that control column is what helps you write your information security policy. If you have a risk listed and a control that says you're reducing that risk, I should be able to trace it to some type of policy. And again, as you can kind of see, this is why it makes this the foundation of your whole information security program. So it's not overly complicated. This one's just an Excel spreadsheet. We work this with a multi-billion-dollar bank, one of the most heavily regulated industries out there. If it works for a multi-billion-dollar bank, it most likely would work for just about any other industry. So, have any questions there, Saeed, before we move on?
Sorry, took me a second to get off mute.
Okay, no problem.
So when we're talking about controls and building policy, something that I guess something that I guess is kind of an organization specific challenge is how do you use a policy or how do you create a policy that does not just become a piece of paper? What is the process to building a policy that is something that is a recording of the actions that we are taking and going to take, as opposed to building a policy that ends up being, something that we wrote and then put in a file cabinet or saved to XYZ SharePoint file, just so we can show we have it. Because the risk assessment super valuable in showing where the gaps are, but you don't close the gap because you write a policy. You know what I
Right.
mean? You close the gap by turning this policy into something that is enforced and used every day. So, I guess if you could give me an example of what was your best turnaround and what was maybe the worst turnaround or least or greatest example of maybe inaction. Of course, not getting into, individual names, but an example of what you saw someone do to really right the ship.
That's a great question, and it may be a long answer, so I'll try not to make it long. But how do we make a policy something that just doesn't die on the shelf, right?
Mhm,
It's management. Got to be management.
mhm,
And I'll state this: when we do an IT control assessment of an organization, we never say IT has failed to do something. Now,
mhm,
if there's a policy that says password should be 12 characters long and IT has the domain security policy set at 8, that's an IT failure. That'll be an
mhm,
IT finding. But most of our findings are management findings.
mhm,
Management has not implemented. Management has not reviewed the policy. Management has not conducted, an assessment of the incident response plan in the last 3 years. It is all how serious management takes this topic.
yeah.
And I'll use banking a lot. We work a lot in the financial industries, um, and they're very, very well put together. They review their policies no less than annually. This risk assessment document is living, but it gets presented to management and the board at least once per year. And it might have a cover letter over it, kind of hitting the high points to say, hey, no big changes, but these 3 things have changed. We need your executive sponsorship to close it. And then when they're done, the board or senior management will go out and hire an IT security firm to come in and do a control assessment. So it's
Mhm,
a third party assessment of the IT controls to make sure the policies are working correctly. Now, it, that works. And that's what we do for a living. A lot of us do for a living, but it only works if you do something with the data. So when you ask the question of what's your worst experience, we have clients that never did anything. They never they didn't use the data, they didn't use the results of the testing to close the gap. So it makes it hard to continue. And then all it took is one personnel change in that organization. On all of a sudden, they're like, why is this way? And they suddenly start making changes. But I think one of my best success stories is an institution I work with, a higher ed institution out of Ohio. We went in year one. I Let's say we had 30 findings. They were emailing us every time they closed the finding, and I'm like, this is
mhm,
like at a record pace. And then the following year, I'm presenting to their board, and their board is asking us questions about the GOBA that I'm like, how do you even know that this
Yeah.
just came out? So those are the success stories when the boards and senior leaders are involved in this conversation, because their whole role here is to put pressure on the CIOs and the CISOs and IT to be doing the right thing. Well, if that
Mhm.
pressure is not there, IT can't do it for them. And I'm former IT, any IT members on the phone, you try to implement a control without the executive sponsorship, you're getting your house burned down. It,
Yeah.
management has to come in and own it. So
Yeah.
I know that was kind of probably could have even been a longer answer, but all of this comes back to management and them enforcing other policies, like an audit policy that we will audit this and we take the results of the audit and do some of our fixes. But you also have to do some of your own self assessments as well. There's no framework out there, NIST or anything else, that you can't download and self assess also and
Mhm.
identify your gaps before the IT audit or the IT control testing gets here.
Yeah.
But the only way the policy doesn't die on the shelf is if management is standing behind it and enforcing it.
Gotcha. So, Johnny, I appreciate that, and I understand. I'm sure we could go on about that, but I think the answer you gave was really good. A second question that I have, you say don't make it too complicated. That sounds challenging in and of itself because a lot of cybersecurity feels like a very complex challenge. We talk about defense
Mhm.
in depth, which is, kind of one piece of a million pieces that are all a part of the process of trying to keep yourself secure. Whether it's technology, policy, or people, everything has to work together. And it's like, you treat it like a Rolex watch and everything has to run together on time in order to keep you safe. All that sounds super complex. How do you make a risk assessment and then utilizing the findings simple or as simple as you can, understanding that sometimes this space we work in just seems overwhelmingly complex?
I think that's a good question, and to me, my answer there is two things. And one, if we have time to get into it, we'll talk about it as a part of the policies. But you should have some type of data classification policy,
Mm.
something that ranks your data from 1 to 5 or 1 to 3, whatever makes works for your organization. 3 being the most critical, 1 being the least. So that when we're addressing risk, inherent risk, and we are using that, we have our scoring from leadership as we've ranked this data, right? So that's one simple step. But if you're just trying to put one of these together, and you can do it without a consultant coming in and helping you, we help a lot of people do it. If you want to do it without that assistance, the best way to me is send your department leaders a quick questionnaire. What data do you have? What data do you see as 100% vital to the operations of your department? Where is it stored? Is probably one of the most critical questions, because we in IT sometimes we don't know that a department has gone out and employed some cloud service provider to store data somewhere. So we have to have a good inventory of where that data is stored. If we grasp that and understand that, it makes filling this document out a little bit easier. Now, when it comes to the controls, you obviously have to have, IT sitting in the room, some security officer, and some IT leaders to say, okay, we do have a control in place, and this is what it is. But if you're staring at each other and you don't think you have a control in place, that's where we get into a little bit of trouble. But when I say don't overcomplicate it, you can look at some samples of risk assessments that will just they look so daunting you just quit before you start. This, yeah, this to me is a little bit easier. You just start listing it. You sit down and I wish I had, if we were doing a risk assessment actual webinar, I would have a tab here. List your most critical devices and your most critical data. Start with that on a second tab, and your brain will start ticking on what are your risks to that bit of data.
Yeah.
So,
All right. Fair enough.
all right, we'll keep moving on. And I know we're probably going to run up against a time wall here, so you you all just ping me when we get there. But the whole point of the risk assessment equal controls, controls equal policy. That's kind of what we were going through a few minutes ago. But again, these controls exist to reduce or mitigate the risk of of organizational assets or data. IT does not have the authority to create controls. It's something I can't stress enough. We as IT are in the service industry to the organization we're working for. We cannot write policy and we cannot implement controls. You don't own it. They're not paying you enough to own it sometimes, right? So that's the most important things. So IT is there to implement those controls that management has created in those policies. So again, management owns IT and the data, and they're the ones responsible for addressing risk. They also own the policy and the governance. Do you write your own vacation policy? Do you write your own compensation policy or work from home policy? No, all of those things are written by management. But a lot of organizations, the policy itself around information security gets kicked down to IT for IT to write. Well, that's just you're going to have a disconnect there between management and the support staff if you do that. So again, to address all these risks, this is why IT is important. The controls must be layered. You can't just come up with one control for one issue, like a password. We have to have MFA and maybe some other methods of authentication. So we have to be very much a partner with management in the risk process and the policy process. But at the end of the day, management has to decide whether they accept the risk where it sits or if it needs to be enhanced.
So
So
that's something you mentioned, the ownership piece. Something that I think comes up in the traditional management structure is that generally leaders and people own their department. Finance is able to do or supposed to do what finance does. Compliance or HR should do what they do. And there's always going to be overlap. An organization should not be so siloed that HR and finance never speak to each other. But I think people often use the excuse that I don't understand technology as a reason to push technology onto the people that are in technology, as though they're the only people that need to understand it. And that sometimes gives the non-technical colleagues that we have the excuse to say, well, this occurred because you didn't fix it, you didn't stop it, you didn't tell me that this needed to be done. Too many times, especially when we look at K-12. K-12 is one of the most challenging spaces to work from a technology perspective because, especially for your small and occasionally your mid-sized school districts or schools, almost anybody is a stakeholder. Grandma, if grandma knows the superintendent, grandma is now a stakeholder. Grandma can tell the superintendent she saw something online or her little grandchild, needs to have X, Y, and Z. And that can be the cause of or the reason why we're now pursuing a new platform or looking at a new technology. There is, and I think this goes back to the selling part for technology leaders and professionals. You have to make it very clear every single day. Technology is not just what we do. Everybody needs technology. And I'm not asking you to be a network engineer. I'm not asking you to be a security engineer. I'm not asking you to, become a PMO all of a sudden. But you do need to understand that you being able to use your VoIP phone or you being able to use your email doesn't just happen like flipping on flipping on the light switch, right? And even if you flip on the light switch, there's a whole lot of stuff going on in order for you to get power. We have to make sure that the people outside of IT understand how big IT is, so that way they understand how big the problems can be. And I think too often we just allow ourselves to stay in our little IT cubbyhole, and then we allow everybody to leave us alone. And then when a problem occurs, everyone says, well, I didn't know that that's how that works. You never told me that, or that was your responsibility. It's like, well, you use the technology as much as I do. So it's our responsibility.
right, and it definitely is our responsibility. And just let's talk about phishing. I can't stop every phishing attack in technology. I do rely on you, the end user, to have enough knowledge to say, hey, this looks a little fishy. I'm not going to click on this. I know this could be dangerous. Everybody has their role to play. No, IT has a lot of pressure on them, right? They are the experts. They are the leaders of their industry, but they don't own the data that's parked on it. So you use like finance, for example. So finance is the data custodian slash owner, but even finance doesn't get to make a decision of how that money is spent. The CFO is allotting money based on the wishes of the board and the best health of the company, maybe not necessarily a personal decision. So even in the finance world, the funds belong to the stakeholders, right? Not to the controller or the staff accountant. So it has to be understood, and I agree with you. We get a little bit of a disconnect there. A lot of data owners either don't want to be data owners or don't realize they are data owners slash custodians, right? So we it's a it does put unfair pressure on IT. It's a difficult challenge, but again, that one has to be addressed by management and through this policy process. Not an easy conversation for sure. So.
Definitely. Yeah.
All right, we'll dig into the governance piece. I think we're in a little bit of a wind down here. We get into the policies, but governance is exactly what it is. I mean, it is how your organization is governed through various policies, human resources policies. You can think of a number of policies that you have. All of those are meant to govern the work environment and the company in the best interest of the company and its success. So the same for security. For an information security policy to be effective, it must be enforceable. We can't write a policy for a company of 30 people like their NASA are protecting DoD secrets. It becomes enforceable and you almost can't work under that. You have to align your policy with that risk assessment. If your risk is low, your policy should reflect that. Um, but the who enforces any organizational policy, again, it's leadership. If the policy is going to work, leadership has to sponsor it. Leadership has to be the voice. And again, policies help management align their goals. And this is not just a security policy, it's all policies for the goals of the institution. So we have to make sure that our information security policies are a part of that. And a lot of times they're kind of left out. So what does your information security or what does your cybersecurity insurance company expect your policy to have in it? And here's just a couple of quick things. They do expect you to have a written information security policy. It has to be updated. It can't be 4 years old. It shouldn't even be 18 months old. It should be looked at annually. And if you're going through your IT control testing and pen testing, you're going to find gaps that are going to cause a change in policy. So you're going to update that, send it back through management for approval. Multi-factor authentication, you will pretty much no longer be permitted to get an cybersecurity insurance policy without MFA. I think everybody on the call that has any part of that understands that one. Security awareness training will need to be formalized, trackable, usually testable. You need to be able to show results that yes, these people have understood their roles as users and what they must do to combat phishing, those kind of things. Multiple backups in separate and independent locations. EDR, endpoint detection and response. That one's kind of a minimum for most insurance companies now. So you have to have that continuous monitoring or some type of continuous monitoring in place. We don't think EDR is enough. I think you should go all the way to XDR, but that's two totally different price tags. EDR does do some things and it will keep your, kind of insurance company happy there.
Something to add to that. We've seen the state of Florida being the most aggressive when it comes to public entities and their reporting requirements and their security requirements. The testing requirements that we've seen for the state of Florida are in line with what cyber insurance providers have. Being able to show that you have a schedule for testing and an enforcement policy based on test results and how people are performing. And I think we're going to see more and more states copying that. And I believe there are like 4 or 5 states that already have that, but
Yeah,
I think Florida was like the first to it.
I think you're right around that number. They're all enhancing a little bit. I know Arkansas has changed theirs over the last year or so for reporting on how you report breaches. I don't know that some states have necessarily gotten into monitoring and things like that. I know the state of Texas is one of the first states that's made it a requirement for information security training for all state employees and I believe cities. And I think Florida's done the same with that recent bill as well. That's so your Florida cities that have to be NIST cybersecurity framework compliant, or at least they should align with that, requires the training piece. So a few more topics here. Methods of vulnerability management. That includes your, vulnerability scans, which most good IT departments own a Nessus scanner or something like that, and they have the capability to do their own vulnerability scans. Most of your frameworks permit that. They do not permit you to do your own pen testing. That is expected to be an independent test. Strong access controls, incident response plans, privileged access controls. That's a big one that has crept up in all the frameworks to be a little bit more serious. How are we reviewing and granting access to individuals that we're going to permit to be privileged users? That must be in there. Encryption of data during transmission and at rest. And adequate data classification. This is not an all-encompassing list by any means. It's just we see applications that are 3 or 4 pages, and we see applications that are 19 pages. So it just depends on who your provider is. But if you want to see what you care about, open that thing up. I mean, that's open up an insurance application. We're not going to go through all of these in the interest of time, I don't think. But if you take a look here, here's just some basic topics that your policy should have in them. And again, your risk assessment is going to drive some of this. Maybe you don't need much of a disaster recovery policy if everything you do is cloud-based and all of your work environment is remote. I can work from anywhere in the world. My DR plan may look different than yours if all of your people are on site. So access controls, again, encryption, logical security, nothing really earth-shattering here, but if you are trying to construct a policy for the first time, this is some good information here, and I think we'll be able to share slides, but there's a lot of great information out on the web as well. And of course, anytime, email me or Saeed, and we will help where we can on that stuff.
2 things to highlight from there, though, that I do want to point out, or a few things: the access control, the end user training, the vendor management, as well as patch management. Those things aren't necessarily sexy. They don't get a lot of the attention. And a lot of those things are things that can either be done with a low cost solution or done in-house. But patch management, I mean, that is outside of ransomware. I mean, even with ransomware, patch management a lot of times is something that, if that's done on a regular basis, can help you to close a gap, can make that process of committing a successful attack a little bit more challenging. Especially when we look at smaller private sector companies. Well, I can't say small public sector entities, because it's really public sector entities of any size. That patch management issue is so frequently one of the big concerns. We had a hospital that had an issue with, I think it was VMware, where they had some out of date software from VM. VM had said, "Hey, you need to go out there and make sure you update this." There was a bit of an issue because VM didn't necessarily publicize it as well as they should, but they did get the information out there, and the entity didn't update their resources as fast as they should, and that left them vulnerable. So those are things that we have to make sure, like access control. You need to know who has access to your data. You talked about knowing what data and devices you have, who has access to that data and devices, because that's also another exposure. If you keep your company laptop sitting in the parking lot, it's almost impossible to keep it secure, right?
Exactly. Well, and I think the vendor management thing is very important because most of us now, during COVID, we had a kind of a rush to cloud technology. We're relying on vendors. Well, how much of us have done our due diligence on that vendor? Has that vendor gone through their IT audits? Do they have a SOC 2 report for you? Can they validate that their controls are in place? Those are questions we have to ask them before we trust them with our data. And that's where the vendor management piece comes in. So, and if you're a higher education institution on the phone, or any other type of financial institution, you're required to have that in place by law. These are some things that you're expected to have in place. But
Mhm.
again, if you stop and think about it, it's a little bit of common sense. Are you going to give your critical data to someone, whether before you find out if they're reputable? Your personal data, work data, whatever. So it's not very difficult. And like Saeed said, it that can be ran in house. Vendor management does not have to be an expensive project either. So, but and any questions on any of those topics, we'll be glad to take them as we go through. And we also know many organizations have different levels of security controls and requirements they're expected to have in place, such as HIPAA, GLBA, many others. Your IT general control testing or IT audit is meant to test your ability to comply with those things. So if you haven't worked with any type of consulting in the past, make sure you're engaging, because they're not meant to come in there and do an IT audit and throw you under the bus. They're meant to come in there and help you identify and close controls, or poor controls. That's kind of the whole point there. They're generally considered consulting engagements, and that's what you need. You need a partner in the trenches with you, not somebody that you feel like is just there to beat you up. And then your pen testing, if you haven't done any type of penetration testing, that's going to assess the ability of your infrastructure devices to kind of defend against some of these attacks. The results of these will affect the risk assessment and the policy. So kind of how we look at that process here is you're going to perform your risk assessment. You identify the new controls and you update policies to enforce the new controls. And then you're going to implement those controls and make sure that we're now aligning with the new policy. Once that's all said and done, you're going to walk through your general control testing and do your pen testing, and we're going to identify those gaps. So once we're done with those gaps, we're back at the beginning of this again. We have to better enhance that risk assessment or the control that's in that risk assessment to reduce that risk or help close that gap. That's going to change the policy again, and you're going to continue this cycle. For most organizations, this is an annual cycle. There's some larger organizations that do 2 IT control tests a year and 2 pen tests a year. Um, it's whatever fits your risk appetite. There's no really right or wrong foundational answer here. It really depends on your organization style, type, and risk and data. But as it was stated earlier, none of us live without IT anymore. IT runs every part of our life. It doesn't matter what company you're in nowadays. You're scheduling. Even our lawnmower, our lawn care guy, he schedules everything on his phone. So what happens if you lose the phone? What if you
Yeah.
don't have that?
What happens
How
if
do
the
you
app
keep
goes
up?
down?
Yeah,
Like when
exactly.
AWS has
So
an outage and you can't get on
right.
Shopify or something like that.
Best thing I always come up with is, uh, what do you do, or what did you do as a kid or even an adult when you lose power during a storm? TV's not working. None of those things are working. So imagine having a ransomware attack and everything you're relying on to function
Hmm.
inside your house or your business is no longer operational. What does that do? And if
Yeah.
we can, I don't like using the word prevent, but if there's controls we can put in place to reduce the risk of these events, that's what we need to do.
Yeah.
Um, so,
And I think the cycle that you have up here on the screen ties into the goal we have for DOF. Our goal in 2024 is to, I guess, sort of aggressively putting into digital transformation as a concept and have everybody that we work with move to the concept of continuous transformation. And that cycle that you have up there on the screen is about continuous transformation. Many of these things that we can do to, like you said, reduce our risk, there may be an upfront cost, but the cost of maintaining and managing can be a lot smaller. It'll take time, it'll take effort, it'll take commitment, but you're not necessarily looking at constantly taking out your wallet and spending money to just simply pay attention to the things that are most important, to the risks that are most concerning for you. So we really want to make sure that we are a part of helping our customers to move in a direction where they are constantly paying attention to those things that are small but important. We can't just look at cybersecurity as we're buying a SIM. We care about cybersecurity because
Mm.
after you purchase that and after it's set up, how much do you care? That's I think where digital transformation leaves most people is that they care about the technology, they care about its performance, its impact, and how to support it during and around the purchase, during and around the setup. And as soon as that's finished, concern plummets drastically.
Yeah, it is very much a continuous process. And I always say there is no light at the end of the information security tunnel. There's no light at the end of the cybersecurity tunnel. It as soon as we close a gap, your attackers, your hackers, they're very intelligent people. They're constantly
Hmm.
doing homework, and we have to do everything we can to keep up because we're
Yeah,
very much responding to them a lot of times for sure. So,
definitely.
but I think just making it continuous, especially that risk assessment process, I think you're going to see overall maturity of your organization increase.
Definitely. Definitely.
But that was our last slide there. I know
Fantastic.
you've hit with some questions, and I'll leave my contact information on the screen here. If you have any other questions, Saeed, to throw out here for the group before we take off.
No, I think we're good. As we wrap this up and make this available, we'll make sure to include your links on LinkedIn, contact information in our YouTube, and all the places that you can get access to our materials at DOF. We'll make sure that you are able to also get Johnny's contact information on Soma Cyber. If you want to reach out to him directly, feel free. He doesn't just work with us; he works with many other folks. So if you want to go and work with Johnny as well, please feel free and we'll make sure that his contact information is available for you. Johnny, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you all. It was great to talk with you today.
Absolutely.